The A to Z quilt design was born out of a love for typography, interior design, and the desire to turn our new letter quilt block PDF patterns into something cozy. The construction of this quilt features combinations of simple shapes sewn together to create 26 letter blocks, the traditional running stitch technique, and a single fold binding hand stitched into place. In this tutorial, I will take you through my process of making this beautiful throw size quilt from start to finish. For this project, you will need a 1/4 meter of contrast fabric for the letter shapes, 2 meters of batting that is at least 60 inches in width, 2.5 meters of fabric for your quilt top, and 2 meters of fabric for your quilt backing. This tutorial includes our new letter quilt block PDF pattern and our complimentary A to Z pattern. Links to these digital downloads can be found in the description box below. Both of these patterns are beginner friendly and include all measurements along with clearly illustrated and written instructions to sew all 26 letters ranging from A to Z, along with a 54 by 69 inch throw size quilt. Before measuring and cutting your fabric for the letter blocks, be sure to print out the template pages which can be found within the instruction book of the Letter Quilt Blocks PDF pattern. Unless otherwise stated, be sure to press your seams open and flat. Once your quilt blocks have been sewn and pressed, measure to ensure that each block is 6.5 by 5.5 inches. If you decide to not stitch your letter blocks when hand quilting, be sure to tack down any intersecting seams on the wrong side of your blocks to ensure longevity of the quilt. All measurements for this quilt pattern can be found in the complimentary A to Z quilt PDF pattern, which can be found in our online shop. To assemble your first set of sewn columns, lay out all pieces to form 5 separate columns, as shown here. With wrong sides together, stitch your quilt pieces and letter blocks together in the correct order, one at a time, until your 5 columns are formed. Now that you've completed your first 5 columns, lay them out as shown here. Then line up all appropriate quilt pieces in between to form 4 additional columns. To finish, lay out the rest of your quilt pieces to form the 2 side columns of your top quilt, and with wrong sides together, stitch all pieces one at a time until your final 6 columns are formed. Now that you've finished sewing all of your columns, press seams to one side away from the letter blocks as shown here. To complete your top quilt, with wrong sides together, line up your sewn columns and pin in place at intersecting seams to ensure accurate piecing. Stitch all columns together and press seams to one side away from the letter blocks. Before hand stitching your quilt, baste all layers of your quilt together with safety pins. Because this is my first quilt, I decided to mark my stitch lines as a guide with a heat dissolving pen like this one. For the hand quilting, I am using a Sashiko thread which is made from 100% cotton. It is soft, strong, does not tangle easily, and works beautifully for hand-quilted projects. Depending on the type of batting you are using, try not to leave more than 3 to 8 inch intervals of your quilt unstitched. Now, using a running stitch, follow your marked lines and stitch all layers of fabric together. To secure your threads, be sure to form a single knot at the beginning and end of your stitch line within the seam allowance, which is equal to the finished width of your binding. This tutorial demonstrates single fold binding, which consists of one layer of fabric wrapped around the raw edge of the quilt. For this 54 by 69 inch quilt, you will need 246 inches of binding plus an additional 20 inches to cover your seam allowance and quilt corners. To figure out the total width of your binding, refer to our table illustrated in the sewing instructions of the A to Z Quilt PDF booklet. To assemble binding pieces, with right sides together, place the end of one binding piece on top of another like so, and stitch at a 45-degree angle. Repeat this step until all binding pieces are stitched together to form one long binding piece. Then trim all seam allowance to 1/4 inch and press seams open and flat. With right sides together, align one end of the binding with the raw edge of the quilt top and begin your stitch line 8 to 10 inches below the binding edge. Continue stitching until you have reached the first corner of your quilt. Pause your stitch line approximately 2 inches away from the corner and mark your fabric 3/4 inch from the quilt edge like so. Continue your stitch line until the needle reaches your marked point, then pivot and stitch at a 45-degree angle to the corner of the quilt. Be sure to backstitch to secure your stitch line. To finish the quilt corner, fold the binding at a 45-degree angle away from the quilt and then back onto the binding. Pin to secure in place. At 3/4 inch seam allowance, begin your stitch line at the edge of the quilt and continue until you have reached the next corner. Repeat these steps until you reach the beginning of your binding, and be sure to stop your stitch line approximately 16 to 20 inches from your beginning point. To join the binding, mark your binding piece with a pin slightly above the other binding edge like so. This will help your finished binding lay snug and flat. With right sides together, align your other binding edge with the pin and secure in place. Now stitch at a 45-degree angle. Trim seam allowance to 1/4 inch, then press seams open and flat and stitch the remaining binding in place.